Well, welcome everybody. This is January 22, and we've got Barry Clasper as our guest caller today, and we will pick on him as we usually do everybody. Okay. All right. Well, welcome, Barry. Glad that you had a day off and you could visit with us.
Glad to be here.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the first question, of course. Is Pam still there over on your left-hand side?
She is.
Okay. What's your version of how you met her?
There she is.
Oh, there she is.
Go back.
Okay, what's your version of how you met her?
My version of how I met her.
Yeah.
Well, there's a family story in there. We met over a Burroughs 5500 computer. You can see the romance already, right?
Yeah.
So I was in the military at that time, and I was working as a programmer in the Queen's Printer Building in Hull. That's Hull. It was Hull, Quebec in those days. Now it's Gatineau, and that was where the mainframe computers that supported the personnel system were. And I had just gone through a programming and systems analysis course and all that stuff to fit me to be a data processing person in the military. And in those days, we had everything was done on punch cards, 80-column punch cards. So there was a room with a gazillion women in it who worked on these key punch machines that punched these cards. And as a fresh new recruit into this organization, people were always trying to set me up with people in the key punch room, which I didn't really find that appealing, actually. And then in the spring, I showed up there in the fall of '68. And in the spring, this girl arrived who was there for, well, you weren't on a university placement. It was just a summer job. And she was working, I don't even know what you were doing there in the office. She was doing, quote, odd jobs. Now, in those days, when you were programming, the way it worked was you wrote out your program on coding sheets and you handed them into this key punch room where they punched everything up. And typically that took 24 hours to turn around. And then you took the deck of cards that you had and you submitted that into the computer room, and it might take another 24 hours to turn around. And in those days, computers weren't too forgiving. So all it took was a misplaced comma or a space in the wrong place, and it wouldn't work. So we were really, really careful about what we call desk checking. So that meant you read the code over and over and over again. And of course, when you make a mistake after you've read it 23 times, you tend to just skip over the mistake because you're so used to seeing it there. So what we used to do is run things by new eyes. And Pam was down the office and down at this office down the hall, and she had interesting new eyes. So I started going down there to help her, to get her to help me desk check and run problems by her, with something when the program actually ran but didn't produce good results, and I didn't know why. Again, trying to work your way through the logic could be kind of hard just doing it by yourself. So Pam became my desk checker, and she was a desk checker for a number of the guys here. That was one of her roles, because she knew just enough to have some vague idea what we were talking about, but not so much that she'd fall into the same traps that we did. So, and she got a lot of, well, it does this and this, oh crap, and there's the mistake, and we'd walk away and leave her sitting in the room. So anyway, that's how we met.
Oh, Okay. And Pam, is that true?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. I guess he wouldn't lie with you sitting right there.
Nope.
No.
I was waiting for a correction of some kind, but I guess I got it pretty much right.
So the odd checker was okay. Yeah, okay. Um, so
That sort of got garbled. Could you say it again?
I say, Pam, the odd checker checked you out and it was all right. Yes?
Yeah,
Okay. Um,
yes.
so, so what got the two of you into square dancing?
Well, oddly enough, it was a friend. I was working in the data center and database board. By then, I was out of the military, but I was still working for the Department of National Defense. So a friend of ours that I worked with in the data center saw when we moved to the base, our idea was, well, we weren't sure we wanted to live on the base, but it was really cheap.
And they offered it.
And they offered it to us. They were sort of hard up to get the houses filled in those days, just at that particular time. And so our thought was when we moved to the base, well, we'll live there for a few months because we moved there in January. And we thought, well, we'll just live there long enough to sort of get the lay of the land and the surrounding area around the base, and then we'll go get a real house somewhere. And it turned out that this was just about the time that housing prices were doing one of their big surges in the early 1970s. So we wound up not moving. But then it turned out we didn't really want to move because we found that on the base, there was like everything you would want to do is on the base. In fact, at one time we counted them up, and I think there was 76 different clubs on the base that included a flying club where you could learn to fly, which I did while I was there. And there were 2 curling clubs and 2 golf courses. And there was archery and blah, blah. It was just about anything you could think of. There was a club on the base, and one of them was a square dance club. And this friend of mine that I worked with happened to be reading the base paper one day, and there was an ad in the paper for square dancing. And I don't know what motivated him to suggest it, but he said, "Why don't we give this a try?" And I was sort of lukewarm about it at first because I already had some experience with square dancing. My parents square danced for years. In fact, I think they went for about 45 years before they quit. And so I had experience of them having dances in their basement, and me trying to sleep 2 floors up from the basement and being kept awake by all these people hooting and hollering and having a good time. It wasn't something that I felt like I wanted to do, but I kind of knew what it was. But we thought, what the hell, let's give it a try. And so we joined the base square dance club, but we couldn't join it right then because it turned out this ad that we saw in the paper was in April, something like that. And the club was folding up in a week. You know, it was quitting for the season, and they weren't going to run their beginner lessons until September. Does this sound familiar? This is a problem that we have now that we're trying to fix. But in those days, we were willing to wait until September. So we started our classes in September. I started a week before Pam because she had just delivered our son, Ken, a week before classes started. So, in fact, were you still in the hospital on that? No, she just gotten home. And my parents, who, as I said, square danced, had fortunately showed up at just the ideal time, just as Pam was going into the hospital, so that they were around when Ken was born and could help with settling him in at home and babysit
Our daughter.
And so as it happened, my parents were there for the first night of classes. Pam wasn't quite ready to go out at that point yet, so I went square dancing with my parents to the local club, and Mom I danced with my mother for the first beginner lesson, and then Pam joined me a week later. So I'm the senior dancer. I've got a week more experience than she does. Not that it's done me any good over the years. She's always been a much better dancer than me.
So, what led you to becoming a caller?
Well, I kind of oozed into it. You know, when we first started dancing, I watched callers and I thought, man, I mean, I can't believe people could do that stuff. That's so neat. And I never visualized myself being able to do that at all. And we danced for 11 years before I actually started to call. And I went through kind of a process of incrementally talking myself into the idea that maybe just possibly I could do this stuff. And what helped a lot with that was during that period of time, I left the Department of National Defense and I joined IBM. And so I was in the IBM marketing branch as technical support. And part of that job involved doing presentations to customers, which was not something I was really comfortable with. The idea of standing up in front of people and talking was not something that I had ever pictured myself doing either, but now it was a job requirement, so I got working on it. And so after having a few years of doing technical presentations to customers and that kind of thing, I got comfortable with the idea of standing in front of people and talking. So that part of calling started to become something that I could picture myself doing. And then I'd also watched, we'd had experience at that time getting into challenge dancing, where there was a lot of tape group activity. And as part of the tape groups, we would have people helping us learn calls and that sort of thing. And so we had people who weren't callers walking us through figures and walking us through calls. And so I started to get the idea, well, I could do that too. And just sort of piece by piece, I got to the point where I could take a whack at calling to a square. It took 12 years to work myself up to that point.
And then the next thing you know, you were a caller.
Yep. So 1984, I started calling in 1984 because I still have cards with 1984 as the date.
Reusable.
Reusable, yeah. Well, not anymore, but most of the calls on them aren't used anymore. But that was, so I used that as my date when I started calling. I think I started writing choreography before that as part of this tape group activity that we were in.
Oh, yeah.
There was one of the tape group we were learning C2, I think it was in. And one of the members was one of the local area callers, a guy named Leo Descharnes, who was a really great caller. But he was learning this level along with us. I think it was C2. And so we were all sort of struggling with some of the choreography, but I'd gotten to the point where I could kind of write some choreography. So the two of us would be writing things and I would give him because he was the caller, right? I'd give him, he wasn't the caller teaching this group, but he was the caller in the group. And so I would give him sequences that I had written to use as workshop sequences with the group. So was doing that before I actually started trying to call anything myself.
Okay. One word. How would you describe yourself?
One word, huh?
Pam can help you.
Quiet.
Quiet?
Quiet.
Okay, so I guess if I ask you if you're an introvert, consider yourself introvert or extrovert, you'd say
Big time introvert.
until you get on the stage, right?
Well, as with a lot of callers, a lot of callers think of themselves as introverts, and the experience of being on the stage is kind of one of our ways of socializing in a controlled environment. You kind of know what's expected and what you're supposed to do, and you know how to do it. So it's one of those things where I think it's a compensating mechanism, actually. I mean, if I go into a party, I tend to stand in a corner and watch other people. So calling is my way of getting up there and talking to people a little bit, at least in a very stultified way.
Yeah. So how nervous do you get before you call?
Well, it depends, of course. There's times when I'm really nervous. In the days of records, there were times when, you know, putting the needle down on the record was a problem. But you know, I've been calling 38 years now, so I've had lots of experiences calling, and so there's situations where I feel pretty comfortable. But I remember actually Anne, you know, your ex-wife, said to me one time, if you ever stop feeling nervous, that's when you got to start worrying, because you know the performance is probably going to suffer. And I found over the years that's true. I mean, there's been times I've got up there and I didn't feel nervous at all, and I could tell it was coming out flat. You know, like it was like I was phoning it in or something. So I find that it works best when you've got that sort of frisson of nerves, just enough that you've kind of got your adrenaline up a little bit and you're paying attention to what you're doing, but not so much that it's paralyzing you.
Yeah, I think that's true of most of us. Don't know quite how to word this one. However,
Oh, wonderful.
was there any time or times when you were really under the weather, either mentally or physically, or you know, had bad news and you still had to call a dance?
Yes, many times actually. There's been lots of times when I didn't feel like my brain was working very well, and I think people that dance to me a lot have gotten used to the line that I usually come up with, which is, "I wish I hadn't said that," as I deliver some ridiculous call from whatever situation we're in. And sometimes there's more of them than I really like in a night. My brain isn't just working very well. But I've also had a couple of situations where I was really sick, but I had to call anyway. There was a case in Sweden, so I'm over in Sweden to call a weekend, and we got there on the weekend. Ran Friday, Saturday, Sunday, I think, if I remember right.
Thursday night C4 dance.
And I had a Thursday night C4 dance as well. And so we arrived and I called the C4 dance and I felt fine. And then overnight, I got deathly ill. You know, I don't know if it was, we thought it might have been food poisoning or something like that, but I mean, it was bad. Spent a lot of time running to the can. And by Friday morning, I was just absolutely wiped. And so I spent all day Friday in bed.
I didn't call in the evening.
And I didn't have to call until the evening. But it was debatable whether I was going to make it or not. And I really don't know if they'd made alternate arrangements, because now they knew I was sick. Of course, I was staying with people from the dance. But I managed to, I felt good enough that I could get up out of bed and go and call the dance on Friday. And I don't really remember much about that dance. The dancers came, the dancers danced. Whether they enjoyed it, I really don't know. And I felt somewhat better on the Saturday, and that was 3 sessions on Saturday. We called it Saturday morning, afternoon, and evening. And this is all me, just me. And then I think there was a Sunday morning, and then there was a C3 on Monday, I think.
2 sessions.
And it wasn't until the Monday C3 that I started to kind of feel normal and realize how sick I had been. It's like, I don't know if you've had that experience, where as you're starting to feel better, you realize how rotten you were feeling in the depths of it. Because after you kind of get acclimatized to it when you're in the midst of it. And that's probably the worst that I've ever had to cope with. I had another case where, again, calling in Europe, in
Germany.
Furstenhagen in Germany, and Clark Baker and I were doing a weekend. And
A week, it was 10 sessions.
that's right. It was 10. It was a 10-session week. I still think those weekends, even though this one started on Tuesday or something.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we were calling, it was a C3D weekend, and we were calling 2 tips, each call 2 tips, and then the other guy called 2 tips. And I had developed a case of laryngitis. I didn't feel too bad, but the voice disappeared kind of quickly. But I found that I could just get through 2 tips before my voice really started to die. And then Clark would come and call 2 tips, and my voice would recover enough during his tips that I could get up and call my tips. And so it took a little management, but I got through that one too. And I've heard tapes of that dance since, and I don't recognize me at all. Like, my voice sounds completely different.
Wow. That's I've had that happen for a convention, the international or the national convention in the States, and I had laryngitis. And it was the year that a lot of the challenge callers, were boycotting because they weren't getting much in the way of the lower level spots. And unfortunately, with that few callers, I ended up calling a lot more than I normally would call. But anyhow, so you started up at the challenge level. Most of us started down at the beginner level with calling. So how could you make that transition, from calling to dancers who knew an awful lot of crazy geometry and concepts and everything else, down to the simplicity of talking someone through a do-si-do?
It's harder than you might imagine. A lot of people make the assumption that, well, if you can call challenge, then you must be able to call, everything up to challenge, and that just ain't true. Challenge calling is definitely a skill set of its own, and there are definitely overlaps in terms of the practice of calling between calling a mainstream dance and calling challenge. But the fact is, they're 2 completely different animals, and the fact that you can call one doesn't mean you can call the other. You've got to look at them each almost as separate activities. And I call, and I don't think I really got so that I could do it with any sense of comfort until after I retired and I started teaching beginners. I hadn't done that before I retired from IBM. But you had Ken Bertucci on a couple of weeks ago, and he was running it wasn't called the Northwest School then. I can't remember what they called it. It was the Sturbridge School is what we knew it as. And he and Randy Page were the owners of it then. And that school has got an ancient history. It used to be Al Brundage and Earl Johnson that ran it. And, eventually at the time that I was there, it was Randy and Ken that were running it. And the staff was Mike Jacobs and Randy Doherty and Johnny Preston. And of course, Randy and Ken. So pretty good staff. And the reason that I went to that school was because I had been calling a weekend at Cherry Ridge, a C3A weekend. And one of the dancers there danced with Times Squares, And he was looking for somebody to do their peel the pumpkin fly-in. And for some reason, on the basis of being at my C3A weekend, he hired me to call Peel the Pumpkin. And of course, Peel the Pumpkin is a mainstream plus with some advanced and maybe a tip or two of C1 here and there. And it's singing calls and the whole routine. And at that point, I really didn't do that stuff. I had done a little bit here and there, but my experiences with calling mainstream were really bad. The one that stuck in my head at that time was I'd had a chance to call mainstream to a couple or three squares at our local T&D convention. And I remembered I called. I didn't know I did this at the time, but I had a habit of calling to right and left grand get outs. That was kind of my standard, right and left grand out of a wave get out. And so I called that to this mainstream floor and they died. They couldn't do right and left grand out of a wave. Oh, okay. Well, I'll just do a turn through to an element left then instead of the right and left grand out of the wave. And that didn't work out too well either. And I found, here I am, I'm toast. I've got an hour with these people and I've got nothing I can call at them. Everything I say is going to terrify them. So I decided I signed up for the caller school, and the charge that I gave them, the caller schools, they often ask you, what is it you're hoping to get out of this school? And I said, what I want to get out of this school is to learn how to call mainstream without terrorizing the dancers. That was literally what I wrote. And they took that seriously. One incident that I remember was Mike Jacobs was the instructor at that point. And somebody had asked the question, why isn't it a good thing to call square through three in the middle and then touch a quarter with the people on the outside? And of course, everybody said, well, that's two right hands in a row. And then, that's not good. So the guy says, well, what could you call instead? And of course, Mr. Challenge Caller just reflexively, without even thinking, says, well, call left touch a quarter. And Mike says, okay. So now you've called left touch a quarter. You've got left hand waves, the boys looking out and the girls looking in. What are you going to do now with these mainstream dancers that, for them, this is a, kind of a sketchy situation to find themselves in. So what are you going to do now? And I'm like, no, I don't know what to do now. Everything I could think of to do from there, even if it was still on the mainstream list, I knew would not go well. So he said, well, you think about it. And this was in the morning. And we broke for lunch. And I thought about it all afternoon. And I finally came up with the magic answer. Boys, you turn back. And, that was a big breakthrough for me. I see people laughing, but the idea that you could use you turn back in a way that flowed and accomplished a choreographic purpose, which was to give me some normal facing lines, which then I could cope with, and let the dancers feel like they were dancing. That was a big revelation to me. That you shouldn't just ignore what we considered the throwaway calls, things like you turn back one. Now, why would you ever call those? You never use them at challenge, right? Because they're not choreographically interesting to the dancers. But that gave me a real place to start understanding how you can use calls at basic and mainstream in a way that is still dancing, but still keeps people feeling comfortable with what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I think you came to one of my caller's schools with that purpose in mind too, of getting a little more information about how to call.
Well, you were actually my first caller school.
Oh, was it? Oh, okay.
That was my very first caller school. So that was at the Treehouse, right?
Yeah.
The log house.
and the log house, whatever you called it.
Big house, yeah.
And yeah, we had our camper in your backyard, and our son, who by this time, this was the son that got born when we started dancing. He was what, 14 then? So he was babysitting Todd, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess that was Todd. He was.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it was somewhat the same. That wasn't quite that I was hoping to learn how to call mainstream or plus from that. It was that I was hoping to learn what the hell I was doing. Because when you start calling it at challenge, it's all about the choreography, right? Which I found I had absorbed because I danced for 11 years before I started calling, and then had actually started dancing advanced and challenge. I was dancing challenge before I started calling.
C3, learning C4.
I have found I had, just through the process of osmosis, absorbed a lot of information about how calls work. And so I found I didn't have much trouble understanding how choreography was put together. And the fact that I was calling challenge meant I could write it down and I could do all my thinking about it in a nice quiet room and write it on a card. And all I had to do when I was in front of the people was I could read the choreography, so I didn't have to have that in my head, and I could concentrate on the presentation and the delivery and the timing and all the other things that go into trying to deliver choreography to dancers. So as much as anything, when I went to your school, I was hoping to get, a better insight into how I could call without having this written choreography in front of me all the time. And I was at that point just starting to learn to sight call. I think I've been calling for 3 or 4 years at that point.
Yeah, 4.
And I had kind of taught myself to sight call, but I wasn't really sure I knew what I was doing yet. So that was kind of where I was going with that.
Mm-hmm.
And also that was where I think I did my first singing call there.
Yep.
And in fact, it was interesting. I got a booking. This was in the mid 2000s. I got a booking somewhere on a recommendation from Anne. Anne had put my name in these people's ears. And it was for a mainstream plus weekend. And I was talking to her about it later, and she had recommended me as somebody who could do singing calls. And I said to her, when did you ever hear me do a singing call? Because at that point, when I worked with her, it had always been, on challenge staffs and that sort of thing, and we didn't do singing calls. And she turned around and she sang the singing call that I had done at your school, just like that. Like she just looked at me and started to sing it. I hadn't remembered it. And yet she remembered the singing call that I did at your school.
Oh.
That I had worked on for weeks and weeks and weeks, and I'd forgotten it. And she remembered.
Oh my gosh. So what do you do in your spare time, aside from calling?
Well,
Knowledge base.
I've gotten involved in, everything I do, now has something to do with square dancing, except actual family things. So our son now lives in New Zealand, so we don't get to see him that much. But our daughter in 2015 moved to Guelph. So for those of you who don't know Canadian geography, Guelph is a city that's about an hour to the west of Toronto. So that's a drivable distance. We can visit back and forth a lot, and we've got a couple of grandkids there. So that's pretty much what we do when we're not dealing with square dance related stuff. But aside from actually dancing and calling, we've gotten involved in organizations that are associated with square dancing. So I've gotten heavily involved in Color Lab. I've been on the board for 12 years now, something like that.
Yeah.
And I'm a past chair, and I've been was on the executive committee for 7 or 8 years, which was ironic, I found, because when I was in my working life in IT, the reason I joined IBM was because I wanted to stay on the technical side of the business. When I was working for D&D, I got a bit of experience working as a manager. What happened was I was the head of the software section in this data center, and the director, like we called him a superintendent of the data center. I always thought superintendent was a dumb name for the guy who ran the data center because it made him sound like the custodian, you know. But anyway, the superintendent of the data center fell ill and was away on an extended sick leave, and they made me the acting superintendent. So I got a real taste of management and politics and all that kind of stuff, at least as it's practiced in the government. And came to the conclusion that I hated it. I did not want to do this. And looking at my career path at that point, I was 30 years old, I think.
Late 20s or 30.
Late 20s or around 30. My career path at that point was, if I wanted to progress anywhere, I had to get into management. Every promotion after that would have been into some sort of management role. So I started looking for another job, but I wanted to work in an area where I could stay technical, but still have some kind of a career that progressed somewhere, that where you weren't just stuck sitting at the same desk for the next 30 years. So that's how I wound up working for IBM. And I can't remember why I started that story now. What was I talking about before I went there?
What you do besides square dancing.
Oh, what I do besides square dancing? Yes, I remember now.
Yes.
So I'd had this nasty experience with management in D&D, and I joined IBM, and through the 30 years I worked with IBM, I resisted mightily the idea of ever getting into the management stream. Even though, just about every second performance review you went to, if you weren't about to get fired, they tried to encourage you to become a manager, even though you were a technical professional. That was just the way it was. And I managed to resist that for 30 years. Then I retire, and I'm in Collar Lab. And within 3 or 4 years of that, I'm chairman. And it's like, how the hell did I get here? I mean, it was just silly that I wound up in the chair after that kind of a career.
Wow.
But I'm heavily involved with Collar Lab still. For those of you who don't know, I'm the operator of the Collar Lab knowledge base. I know some of you know where that is. Daryl is a great contributor to it. He's got a number of items up there for it. And Don Beck is another guy that's got a lot of material in it. If any of you have material, I would definitely welcome it. Please contact me. Pam is also, she's retired now too, and she's heavily involved with the IAGSDC. So she's the president of All Joint Hands Canada, which is a foundation that's associated with the IAGSDC, a charity. And she works on the History Wiki. And what else are you doing? Oh yeah, there's this convention that they're running in Canada called Ottawa 2023, which is the IAGSDC convention next July.
This July.
This July. Well, this coming July. 5th to the 8th. You all come.
She's the co-chair.
She's the co-chair. And I know some of you actually are coming. I can see some people there who are actually signed up. I know Duna is signed up, and Et is signed up, of course. And I think Dave and Mary are signed up too.
Yes, they are.
And I've seen their name in it. Pam keeps me apprised of these things, of course. So anyway, that's what we do with our, quote, spare time.
Uh-huh. You sound like a boring couple, I mean, don't go anywhere, don't do anything.
No, we just sit around the house and,
it's like most of these folks on this screen here. It's, what a rich history we have all over here.
Double.
One last question before we get to the commercials. Um, oh yeah, what is one of your most embarrassing things to happen on the mic?
Square for squares.
Embarrassing things.
Square for squares, changing the pavement.
Ooh, right. Well, I wasn't actually calling. This was before I started calling, but during our 11 years, before I started calling, we were on the executive of 2 clubs,
Well,
or
well,
3,
I know,
2, anyway.
we
It seemed like any time we joined a club, we lasted about a year, and then we got elected to the executive. And so I was the president of Scarborough Squares, which was a 3-level club that danced on 3 separate nights. And so we had this regimen of we danced one of the nights ourselves, and then I would go out on one of the other nights. Of course, you got to remember that we had babysitters and stuff whenever we went out together, so we didn't go a lot of places together except for our one night out square dancing. So I would go to the other groups on an alternating basis to, show the flag from the executive and all that stuff. So we had just determined that we were going to have to change the way that we did our fees. We had to raise the fees, and we were going to try and encourage people to pay them up front instead of coming on a dance by dance basis, so that we, had a steadier income stream coming. So I get up on the microphone and I explained to them how we've decided that we're going to adopt a new structure. And that was one of those, I can't believe I said that moments.
That's good. Well, hey, it's time for commercial. So it's commercial not only but you and Pam as well, because between the two of you, you have a number of things probably to tell us about coming up.
Well, not really. We've got the convention in July, which Pam being co-chair is kind of becoming all consuming now. We're sort of in the home stretch to that. And we've got what, 600 and
just over 600.
Just over 600 people registered already for that.
Germany,
I'm doing a C3A weekend in Germany in March, and I've got a West Coast ANC weekend in Albuquerque, New Mexico over Labor Day. We've managed to we've cut back on our travel quite a bit, or at least we haven't restarted it the way we were going before the pandemic. And partly that's because we decided that what we were doing before the pandemic was just silly. It was one of those things that had gradually, accreted and accreted and accreted until it was all covered with barnacles. When the pandemic started and we had to start canceling, we had to cancel 6 flights, 6 trips that those are the ones that were already booked, or, that we had flights booked. Those weren't all that there was. And we found, at least I found, I think Pam agrees with me, we found we kind of enjoyed the slower pace in the pandemic. So we're trying to make sure that it doesn't grow to that again. So we're taking fewer dates where we have to travel long distances and
calling more at home.
And I'm calling more at home now. And in fact, that's starting to look kind of busy too. One of the things when we remember this guy Leo Descharme that I mentioned earlier was one of the callers in our area. He was one of my mentors as I was coming up. He gave me a lot of opportunities to call, but he had a full-time job. He was an insurance broker, and he also called 6 nights a week. And I mean, that's just crazy. And I know probably some of you out there do that. But I couldn't maintain a pace like that. That is just nuts. So trying to keep it down to, 2 or 3 nights a week at most, And even less than that would be okay with me, but especially these days with we're losing a lot of callers. You know, we've lost a couple in our area just recently, and not necessarily because they died. People are retiring, you know. But yeah, so there's you know, a little more pressure on those of us who are still working to call more, to travel farther, and that sort of thing. And it's a problem. I think we need to really need to work at developing more callers than we are right now, which is one of the reasons I became a caller coach.
Oh, on that subject, okay. So what, you know, it's really hard to nail down what one most important trait or skill do you think a new caller needs to have or should be developing?
Well, there is no one most important trait. Calling, I've heard the analogy from several people, and I think it's quite true, that calling is kind of like juggling. You got to keep a lot of balls in the air. It doesn't look like much until you learn how to get at least 3 of them in the air at the same time. So saying that there's kind of one thing that's you know, the most important thing, I don't think it's too helpful. But what is true is that the skills that you need to develop soonest depend on where you start. So going back to the fact that I started at Challenge, the reason I started at Challenge is because that's where the opportunity was to call to people. So I think the most important thing that any developing caller needs to have access to is people who will dance to them. There's a lot of theory and academic looking kind of stuff associated with calling. But when it comes right down to it, you've got to be able to work with those people milling around in front of you. And it's like riding a bicycle. You can read about it all you want, but until you actually get on the damn bike and try and ride it, the stuff you've read doesn't mean anything. And calling is like that. You have to have the opportunity to call to people. So the most important thing is to somehow get a group of people who are willing to let you practice on them.
And be prepared to put in the work.
And one of the advantages of starting a Challenge is that Challenge dancers are often working in small little groups, and they don't have somebody who really understands any. There's nobody in the group, let's say, who is really more knowledgeable than anybody else that can kind of guide things. So for somebody to come along and say, I'm willing to call to you, groups like that are, you know, they're happy to grab that opportunity. So you can kind of make a deal with them. I'll use you to learn to call if you'll put up with me learning to call, and I'll teach you to dance. It's easier to do that at Challenge, I think, than it is to try and get a group of beginners together. And in fact, I don't think newer callers should be the ones to teach beginners, because I think that is a skill set that is much harder than calling Challenge. You have to work with a reduced number of tools at your disposal. You have to completely change your approach to choreography. So it's
The personality
and the personality and the presentation and all that kind of stuff matters more than the choreography does. So it's something that, and plus the order in which you do things, and the foundation that you build in these dancers is really important for their dancing career. So you don't want somebody who's learning themselves to be doing that for teaching dancers. But that's what we do. A lot of clubs, it's their least experienced caller that they give the beginners to. And I think that's exactly backwards. So by starting it, now I forget why I started that story as well. You get real long-winded, then you forget where you were going. So we starting at Challenge, I had the opportunity to work with one of these tape group things. And it was, I was teaching them a level, and they were happy to be learning something that they wanted to learn. And at the same time, I was learning to call on them, and they were happy to put up with, my learning curve. So if you're a newer caller, my first recommendation would be is to figure out how you can manufacture a group like that that's willing to let you practice on them for whatever reason. Maybe they're willing to let you practice on them just out of the goodness of their hearts, because they're far-sighted people who realize that if we don't develop some callers, we're probably not going to have as many dancers as we do now. So there are lots of people out there that are like that are starting to realize, we've really got to help groom callers if we want to keep dancing alive. But also, if there's something that you can do for them as well, so that it's not all a one-way transaction, you should grab it. A lot of clubs these days are doing things where they'll have a session before their actual teaching session, where they'll review what was done last week for the people who missed it. And so often they will have somebody who is not the club caller do that. And so that's an opportunity that you may try and get if you're developing as a caller. But that's probably the most important thing, is to develop that opportunity to call. But then the things that you choose to work on depend on what that opportunity is. So if the opportunity is teaching beginners, well, then you're going to have to start working on how can I develop choreography that only uses these 4 calls so that I can teach this 5th call. That kind of thing is what becomes really important. How can I learn how to do a singing call? Because they're going to expect to learn how to do singing calls. If you're starting a challenge the way I did, then you don't need to learn anything about singing calls. You don't have to learn how to sight call because they're happy with your reading. So the skills that are most important for the group that you're working with are different. And that gates what you're going to start working on first, until you can get all 3 balls in the air, and eventually 5 and 6 and 7 balls in the air.
Yeah. Not only that, but you've got everything that's off mic stuff, all the scheduling and the finances and loads of stuff. Daryl had put in a thing to everybody in the chat saying callers call, and I like that. Those 2 words are really the truth in terms of that. What a flowchart you could make off of that to all those things that we have to do. It's like Don Beckett said, I think, that there's probably no other kind of a job that you can find that has to balance so many balls in the air.
Yeah.
It's judgment. It's not, you call the call and they do something, and you've got to think about what to do next. And you might have thought next call was going to be a swing through, and they did something different on the previous call.
Yeah.
You're always juggling, but I think that's part of the fun of it. Okay.
Ed Foote wrote an article along those lines too, where he said there's no other job that requires you to make so many decisions in such a short space of time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think that might be something of an exaggeration. I'm sure there's got to be jobs that are at least as heavy in decision making as calling is, but certainly you're making many decisions over a very short space of time, a second or 2.
Even for the dancers, as a dancer, the more I call, the more I get impressed with people that learn how to square dance at all. The whole idea of a foreign language, and you have just a certain amount of time to do the thing, and you got where to go and which direction to turn and whatever. Auctioneering, auctioneering might be one of those things that you have to balance a lot of balls in the air.
But I mean, when you think about has to be going on in a dancer's head when they're dancing, in theory, if we're giving them wind in your face choreography, they hear the call, and after they've heard the call, they get one beat of music to step off. That's typically what we give them.
Yeah.
So that's half a second. Like if we're dancing at 120 beats a minute, which actually is a slower pace, that's half a second to figure out what the call means and what that means they have to do based on where they are in the formation and what had happened before, because some calls actually depend on what went before them as to what the action is going to be. And, it's really complicated. And it's not at all surprising that some people struggle with it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah. Is there anybody want to ask Barry a question? Kind of raise your hand or just jump right in. Unmute yourself, of course. Okay, Robin?
Barry, do you have any experience or any feelings about the quote unquote SSD program?
Well, yeah, I was sort of part of the team that shepherded that through Collar Lab. I'd like to say I have a lot of experience with SSD, but I can't really, because I've yet to really convince my local groups to do actual SSD. We've started teaching it several times now. So we work off the SSD list, and it's really just become a teaching order for them. Because in order to implement the SSD philosophy says, we're going to learn this stuff in 12 to 14 weeks or whatever. And I'm also discovering that 12 weeks for that teaching program is pretty ambitious. I think it actually takes longer than that to teach ordinary mortals, at least the ones we get, the list of material on the list. So the idea is you can teach them that, and then they can continue to dance that for as long as they want. So in other words, they then, after they've moved past those lessons, they have a regular dance to go to every week or whatever the dancing interval is. And they can come to that dance without having to learn any more calls. They may learn some new things about some of the calls that they've learned, some extensions or new formations that they could do it from or something like that, but they don't have to learn any new calls. And they can dance at that level forever without necessarily wanting to move on. So that's the philosophy. But if you look at that philosophy, what it means for most clubs is that they have to carve out a new space for that SSD dance, right? The SSD lessons, if they were teaching beginners before, well, now they're just teaching the SSD in that slot. But when they have to carve out the SSD dance, that means now they need a venue for that. They need a caller for that. They need a night for that. And a lot of clubs can't come up with that. And the clubs in our area are really struggling with that. So what it's turned into is we teach SSD and get through the teaching program. And then they say exactly what they've said this year. There's a dance in our area called Spring Spree that we often target as something we'd like to get our dancers ready to attend in the spring, in April. And their lowest level is going to be mainstream. So if we want them to go to that dance, now we got to take them to mainstream. And we're not giving them a place in our club to dance SSD. So it's, we haven't implemented SSD. So I can't say I have a lot of experience with doing SSD. I've done a lot of reading, seen a lot of the theory, and I helped build some of the theory, but can't say I've actually done it.
But there are areas that do.
But there are areas that are doing it. Again, in the knowledge base, one of the neat things about being the guy operating the knowledge base is that it gives me a real overview of our activity, because I see stuff going on all over the world, literally, and what people are doing. And there are areas that are actually implementing SSD as it was designed, and they seem to be having good success with it. The trick is getting past those logistical hurdles to implement it as it was designed.
Anybody else? Okay, one last question for you, Barry. If you could be remembered for one thing in your calling situation, if you could be remembered for one thing, what would that be?
For one, you mean one thing that dancers think about me as a caller, or some accomplishment that?
Yeah, I would say as in a very general way. For instance, someone might say, well, I'd like to be remembered as a really good singer, or a really good choreographer, or a really good teacher, or a generalist.
Well, I'm certainly a generalist. I've often thought I'm one of those jack of all trades, master of none kind of things, because I mean, I've done everything from party nights to C4, and it's questionable how well I do any of them. I've certainly discovered that there are some elements within that range that I don't feel I do a good job with. I still do the odd party night, but I don't relish doing them. It's I always approach them with great trepidation and fear, because I'm aware of all the things that could go wrong that I don't have the tools to handle. Just depending on what kind of crowd shows up. So whenever I come out the other side of one of those, and it seems to have been successful, my feeling is just relief. It's like, got away with another one, but I don't feel really jazzed up about it. But I guess I work hard at being an agreeable person to work with. I try not to be an asshole, I guess so if people can remember me that way, I'd be happy with that.
The dancers to have a good time.
Well, as Pam says, I want the dancers to be having a good time, and I want to be having a good time with them having a good time. There are nights when the dancers are having a good time and I'm not. And that's because I feel like I'm working too hard to give them a good time. Like, you know what I mean? When you're in the groove and in the flow, it all just seems so effortless, and the dancers are just cooking and you're cooking. And I mean, that's, to me, that's what I live for.
Yeah.
Those nights, they're rare. And so they stand out when I've got a small handful, 4 or 5 of them that I remember over my 38 years of calling now, as like, yeah, that was a night. But yeah, basically people like working with me. That's what I'd like to think I'm leaving behind. I'd
agree. I would agree. I think anybody that's worked with you would agree that there's always someone on the stage you're working with that wants to be the star, and I think it's so much easier to kind of just hang back and let them go ahead and be the star.
Yeah, especially when you're an introvert, right? That's your tendency. Although I have to say, I've had the chance to be on the stage with a lot of the big names over the years, and by and large, they're a really professional group that, I can't think of anyone in particular that I really hated working with because they were an idiot. And there's some that are just so generous and professional. Well, here's a story from my first gay convention, the first IHSD convention we did, Crack the Crab in Baltimore, 2000. And so it's my first time on one of these staffs. And it was early on when I still was struggling with Mainstream and Plus and that kind of stuff. I did a lot of challenge, and I could call Mainstream and Plus, sort of, but I wasn't really that good at it. And there's a guy named Mike DeSisto. I don't know how many of you know that name. I know some of you do, but he's retired now. But at this time, he was just the god of the gay convention. Like, he was on year after year after year, and they just loved this man. And I'd never met him until this convention. And at the time, I was doing a singing call that he had put out called Ain't Never Seen. So I was just coming off the stage in the Plus Hall. And as I'm coming down the stairs, Mike is following me, and he's going up the stairs onto the stage. And that convention was really weird because it was in a convention center, and it was attached to a hotel, but the convention center in Baltimore is 3 blocks long with flyovers across the streets that go through the middle of it, right? And we were at one end of the convention center for the main dance halls. And then a lot of the auxiliary dance halls, which is what the challenge halls were, of course, where I was spending a lot of my time, were at the other end in the hotel itself. And it literally, it took you a good 15 minutes to walk from one place to the other. And so I was on my way from Plus to C2 out in the hotel, but I had a half an hour. Or no, I had an hour. That's right, I had an hour. Anyway, I'm coming down off the stage. Mike's going up. He says, "You want to hang around and do something with me?" Well, I'm nervous, but I don't want to pass up an opportunity like that. So he says, "Well, come on, you can do the second tip with me." So he gets up there and he starts calling, and he starts into the singing call. Now I'm standing on the stage, or on the stairs up to the stage, and it happened to be a singing call that I knew. So I'm just sort of singing along with it under my breath as Mike's doing it, and I'm halfway down the stairs. I'm not on the stage, but he looks down and he sees me, calling along with it. And so he calls. Oh, that was when he asked me to come up. That's right. He after that tip is over, that was when he asked me if I'd do the next tip with him. And so I said, sure. And so when we go to select the singing call, I said, "Mike, I've been doing one of your singing calls a lot. I really like it. It Ain't Never Seen." And he says, "Oh, yeah." He said, could we do that one? Because I really know it well. So he says, "Sure." So he gets it out and he says, "You start." So he puts the record on. Now, Ain't Never Seen has a 32-beat intro on it. Like, there's no choreography going at all, just 32 beats of introductory music. The music starts, the kid here starts off with the intro figure, right? 4 boys promenade inside, blah, blah, blah. And of course, that ain't right. There's supposed to be 32 beats of nothing there. And Mike looks at me like, "What the hell are you doing?" But he doesn't say a word, just sort of listens to me do it. And then somehow he manufactures 32 beats of extra stuff in the first figure that he does, so that we're sort of back on track. And he gets it all synced back up again. And okay, now I'm sort of back in with it now. Now I know what I'm doing. And we managed to finish the singing call, but I am just mortified. Right. I told him, "I know this singing call. It's one of my favorites." And I screw it up like that. But he was so generous to me over that. And in fact, he kind of took me under his wing for the rest of the convention and shepherded me around and, helped me with stuff on stage and whatnot. And he just one of the most generous men. And he wasn't the only guy that, had that kind of attitude to callers like me who were new to the situation. So a lot of the big guys, they're really nice guys.
Yeah, I have to agree. Mike was, the thing I remember Mike most for was trying to set my car on fire. he came up for a week of tutelage or mentoring for C1. He was learning C1, and he didn't dance it, so he wanted to learn all about it. So we spent a week trying to get him through C1, and he said at one point, he said, "Look, can we go out to the liquor store?" He wanted to get some Grand Marnier. I said, "Sure." So we go out. He gets his little bottle of Grand Marnier. He gets in the car, and he has a little shot glass. He puts the stuff in, and then he lit it on fire, and the flame goes. Well, he'd blow it out and drink it, but anyhow, it was just, kind of scared me. Anyhow, it's been great having you on, Barry. There's so much. Before we go, I do want to thank Et too for putting out a real nice blurb about the callers and cars for today. Put out a nice thing on Facebook, email, and emailed everybody. So, everybody here is so gracious. For any dancers on this site, the callers you see, these people are the cream of the crop for whatever reason. I don't care whether it's for great choreography, for great teaching, you name it. They embody the best of everything. Okay? So thanks, Barry, and thanks everybody for showing up.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Yes.
It's been a blast.
Okay. Good to have you. We got Wade Driver up next week. If my internet. I was scrambling today. I have to thank local square dancers just to hear from who, like I say, they not only loan me their internet, even their house. That's where I am now. I'm in their house. So, the square dance community has been good to me. Okay, so thanks, Barry. Thanks, Pam. I know she's in the background.
She's right here.
I can't see her. There she is.
There, hi.
Okay, everybody knows Pam. Good. Okay,
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. I enjoyed that one. Thank you.
thanks, Eileen.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Joe.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
coming.
Barry.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Barry.
Bye. Thank you.
I'll let you all say goodbye.
So you going for breakfast now, Duna?
Yes, I'm 5 hours from home. I'm heading home today. So I've been away in Sydney. I saw Brian Hotchkiss. I danced to him on Saturday night, which was good fun. And yeah, getting out. There's not much dancing in Australia in January because it's like July or August. In America, it's the summer holidays.
Yeah.
So I went looking for
New
some.
Zealand, you put on a dance for us.
Yeah.
So anyway, lovely to see you all. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Howard.
Oh, is that how-
And Di, are you about to go to bed?
Yes,
Yeah.
actually, we're wrapped up in a fleece because I've been out calling this weekend and we just got back before this started and the house has been cold all weekend, so it's freezing in here.
Ah.
So we just got wrapped up. That's all. Yeah.
Yeah, we have one of those marriages where one of us is always hot and the other is always cold. So Pam is the hot one and I'm the cold one. You can see I'm in my fleece in the house. She says she's got a limited number of clothes she can take off, but I can put lots of sweaters and stuff on. So we keep the house a little cooler than I like.
20.
Good point. Yeah.
All right. See you all next week then.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye,
thank you,
everyone.
Joe.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye,
Barry.
Di.
Thank you very
I'm
much.
I'll let Joe kill it.
Pierre.